Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Today I'm talking with Frederic Laloux, author of Reinventing Organizations, a book that literally revolutionized the way we think about organizational management and leadership. Frederic is here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his book that has sold over 1 million copies and changed the way we think about running businesses. In our chat, we get into what it means to move from old school corporate structures to more dynamic, self-managing, and purpose-driven teal organizations. Frederic shares his thoughts on how things have changed over the last years since his book was first published and what's happening now in the world of work. This episode is full of great insights on leadership, personal growth, and building companies that are meaningful and fulfilling to all stakeholders. So whether you've read Reinventing Organizations before, or this is your first time hearing about it, trust me, you're going to be truly inspired by the movement Frederic has created. So let's get started. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Hey, Frederic, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, yeah, I'm very excited. We just had like a 5-minute pre-chat, and I'm already psyched about this.
Super. Hey, congratulations! It's been 10 years since your book Reinventing Organizations came out. In preparation for this discussion today, I went through and I said, when did I first read this book? And so I looked in my Amazon cart, and luckily it tells me, all the orders. So I actually got the book in January of 2015. So I was fairly early reader of the book. But the really revolutionary thing about the book Reinventing Organizations was codifying companies along this color spectrum and saying, where are we today and where could we be going? And what you brought into the nomenclature and into the vocabulary was really this idea of a teal organization. That's that's a dynamic thing. It's living, breathing, and there's a lot of properties around what it means to be a teal organization. But that, of course, was totally unheard of in 2014 when you first published the book. Now that we're 10 years on, I know that you're doing a new edition with a new forward and really excited to see that come out. Question for you as we kick off here is, what does the world look like in 2024 versus 2014? What's happened in the decade in between?
I think two things have happened. One, the dominant management model, right? The one that is being taught in business school that, the McKinseys of the world promote, is even more exhausted now than it was 10 years ago. And, trying as hard as we can to improve our budgeting processes and improve our strategic planning and all of those things. But, and so, yeah, the sort of disengagement of the masses at work, is higher than it was 10 years ago. The overwhelm of the poor people at the top of organizations is higher than it was 10 years ago. The number of meetings has increased. So that model is still hanging on, but it's more exhausted than it was 10 years ago. I think the other difference is that for those people who are ready to say, hey, I no longer believe in this model, I'm looking for something else, we're much further along than we were 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, the discourse was like, the model is broken, but we don't really know what to do. We grasp for fixes. And I think that now we have sort of models of, okay, if this isn't what I want, there are actually coherent, models out there that are a better fit for our times, right? And, whether you call them teal organizations, or some people go for holacracy or sociocracy, or, all sorts of ways to name them. But sort of as a field, for those people who say, I'm done with this, we now not only have alternatives that are quite well understood, that are quite well conceptualized, but we have many, many more examples of these organizations. And so you no longer look like a crazy fool that is throwing out the baby. You can actually point to all sorts of, places and go like, this is working. This is not radical.
So in some ways, we have the same amount of stasis, or maybe even more so, in terms of like corporate, bureaucratic, profit first. And at the same time, there's still a lot of innovation happening in the purpose over profit world, or the multi-stakeholder world. And there's things like conscious capitalism and holacracy and your work. And so how do you see these tensions playing out in the market? Do people still say, well, there's only one way to make money and everybody else is doing this kind of woo-woo fringe stuff? Or have we now proven over the last 10 years that actually you can have a successful, healthy business with these new models?
You can absolutely, but you still have to know where to look to see them. Right? We don't have yet sort of a mainstream example. We don't have an Apple or a Google or, an organization that everybody would know that you could point to. And I think that is going to be a big breakthrough when that happens. So now, you have to know these organizations. If there have been examples, maybe less familiar to audiences in the US because they're not very present in the US, but like the world's largest sports retailer called Decathlon, had an amazing run for 10 years under a CEO who just, broke everything open. And their success was amazing. And they're 100,000 people. So now we're talking serious numbers. There's something now interesting happening in Bayer, this huge company that bought Monsanto, where Bill Anderson, who already, previously at Roche and Genentech, had done pretty amazing things, is trying something really radical. And, we all got to hope that he's successful. So, I imagine that if we have this conversation 10 years from now, we can probably point to 2 or 3 sort of examples of really large organizations. And I think that that's the moment where the dam might break, because then people are going to say there really is no reason, to cling on to this old model.
Now, for listeners who aren't familiar with reinventing organizations and aren't familiar with this, I think it's worthwhile to do a quick primer. And the way that you describe these different approaches to business, use these color codings. But the main idea is, we're going through these kind of evolutionary breakthroughs, right, and around collaboration. And so the colors are, red, amber to orange to green to teal. And each one of these has different attributes. They have different sort of stepping milestones or stepping stones from one to the other. And then what I always found really interesting in your work is you use these metaphors for it, right? And you use metaphors like wolf pack or these military metaphors, or one that is super prevalent, especially in the MBA world, where I come from and you come from. We both have MBAs from INSEAD. One of the most prevalent metaphors is the idea of a machine, right? The company is a machine. There's inputs, there's outputs, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens in between. Those are really, to me, they sound very 20th century, kind of outdated. Once we get into the more dynamic models, you get the idea that maybe this is a family, or this is more like a living organization, that sort of thing around green and teal. But give us just a very quick primer on the structure here and how this came to be color-coded like it is.
Yeah. So this is not my work, right? I stand on the shoulders of giants who have looked, like a lot of philosophers, historians, anthropologists, etc., have found that human evolution doesn't happen sort of, linearly step by step, but that we go through these big leaps, right? And so, humanity went from, being hunter-gatherer to having these chiefdoms to having, to the agrarian revolution, which brought us, civilizations and the religions we know. And then the scientific industrial revolution was this other big leap, right? And then, the information age and postmodernism was this other big leap. And it feels like we're on the cusp of, one more of these leaps, right? And so this is very well established, right? And people have looked at, how did human cognition change at each of these stages? And how did human religion and spirituality change? And how does political governance change, right? And one area that nobody had really looked at was, how does collaboration change? How does management change? And when I looked into it, I found that, hey, each of these stages has a coherent way of looking at management. And every time we make a leap to another stage, we also come up with a whole new management structure, practices, principles.
Language, even. We need new language to talk about how we're doing things.
And every new stage is able to deal with way more complexity than a previous stage, is able to scale to much bigger organizations, to go much faster, to innovate more, right? And so the idea that, our current management model might be outdated and that there might be a new one that's coming online isn't really very radical. This has happened, 5 or 6 times before. And, this is, we're just on the cusp of one more. And I'm not sure we need to go through each one of those, sure. But like, just to give an example, like it seems like the very first organizations, and I'm using the color coding of this philosopher, this amazing man called Ken Wilber, who I think lives next door to where you live. And so he has, written about these stages and he's given these colors. And so, in the tribal world, you have the first organization that come online, which are these red organizations. And they're pretty small. They tend not to scale. Modern remnants, examples of this are gangs and wolf packs. And the management of this is pretty simplistic, which is you have an alpha male at the top who needs to inspire fear in everybody else to keep them behaving in a certain way that's beneficial for the organization. And if he shows the slightest sign of weakness, and I say he because in these organizations it's mostly he, a younger one will come from behind, stab him in the back and take his place, right? And so these are fear-based organizations. And, we have some of that still in modern organizations. Like you have subunits where you have, somebody, who looks at the world from this perspective, right? Donald Trump looks at the world very much from, this perspective. And so these, are red organizations, very simple, right? Very different from a modern organization. I'm going to make a leap through 2 stages. Mm-hmm. The dominant model, as you were pointing out, that we're teaching in business schools corresponds to the worldview that we've inherited from the scientific industrial revolution, right? And that worldview is, it's not power that rules the world. It's not God that rules the world. It's actually intelligence that rules the world, right? The world is this complex mechanic, and the more I understand its inner working, if I'm faster at understanding it than my competitors, then I will, innovate more, make more money, make more profit. And so the management model built around that perspective is a good organization is like a good machine, right? And if you look at the language we use in management and, sort of dominant management, it's really engineering language, right? We have inputs and outputs and resources. Even humans are resources, right?
And we're optimizing things, we're streamlining things, we're removing friction.
Yeah, when we redesign the organization, we create a blueprint, and it's all of that engineering language, because fundamentally we view an organization as a machine, and that's it was a very successful model. I mean, that has brought us the prosperity, that has exploded over the last, 100, 200 years. But now we're getting to the limits of that model, right? It's crumbling under its own weight. The world has become so much more complex, but we're still trying to run it in that way with sort of the good old pyramid and, the poor executive committee that has to digest PowerPoint after PowerPoint after PowerPoint to make decisions. Right. And all of these mechanisms that we've put in place of budgets and incentives and 3-year plans, et cetera. The world is moving so fast that anybody who's been in a budgeting exercise in a larger organization knows that it's pretty much a fiction. Right. I mean, everybody is sort of sandbagging, is trying to, bring in low numbers so that they can exceed them, and then they get yelled at, and then it's this negotiation. And then that once a budget is frozen, a month later, 2 months later, the world will have changed so much because there's a war in Ukraine, because there's COVID, because, the dollar versus the yen, and everybody knows this is a fiction, but we still hang on to it. And we spend this enormous amount of time because that gives us a sense of control that we have, from this scientific industrial perspective. And so that's the model that a lot of us feel like, okay, we get it. It worked for a while. There must be something else.
So we're trying to evolve from that orange phase, if you will, and so we're stuck in this. This is the default status quo is this orange phase.
That's what everybody has in their minds.
We've got to beat the competition, hit our numbers, management by objectives, and by the way, these are all control mechanisms, right? These are all control mechanisms designed to make it easy for me to understand the future and control the future. Yeah. And so hopefully we're in the process of evolving beyond that.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so as you were pointing to, there's 2 models beyond that. Sort of when we leave the scientific industrial age and go to the information age, there's this notion of organizations as families, green organizations who use Wilber's colors, right? And you see like a lot of very successful organizations, have used that sort of model, historically, like Ben and Jerry's and Whole Foods and Southwest Airlines when they were still very successful, and right, and that provides a step. But then the next step is really sort of these teal organizations that put a lot of the current management, practices on their head, are way more flexible and agile to be able to meet this incredible complexity that we're facing today.
So in many ways, you're someone who is I want to say a product of the traditional system, meaning you went to school, you had a job, you went to, one of the best known business schools in the world, INSEAD, you got your MBA, then you were working for big companies doing consulting projects and all this other stuff. And so you were a product of, this orange, metaphor, so to speak, of like business as a machine. What happened in your life to make you say, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way here. I can be a part of coming up with new ideas for the future. And I recognize that where we are today is not satisfying, not satisfactory.
That's a really interesting question.
Because certainly when you were getting your MBA, they were not teaching this type of thing.
No, and I already felt, that there was more to life and to collaboration than what I was, receiving there. Even though it made sense, right? It makes sense in that one worldview. But I think if I'm fully honest, probably one of the things that played a role is both my parents died when I was quite young. I was 19, and they were very, very brilliant people, really, and very successful in their field, but not very happy. And died young. And so when I was in business school, when I was at McKinsey, and I saw the partners at McKinsey, I saw the CEOs and the C-suite, that we were working for, I recognized quite some things that I saw in my parents, which is these are brilliant people, and boy, they don't look very happy, right? They're very intelligent, but like the most important choices don't feel like they're right, right? But I didn't have an alternative choice either. I was still in that system, right? I remember, I was wearing a suit and a tie, and I was in hotels, and I was in airplanes, and when I was in a check-in line in the hotel, I was seeing everybody with a laptop in their suits, and I was like, you realize that looks a little ridiculous, right? But obviously, I was looking down, and I was doing the same thing, right? I was part of it. So there was something in me that felt like something was off, and didn't fully believe in it. And then I had one day. In 2006, so this is a while back, I had this amazing coaching session with this one woman that gave me a 3-hour coaching session. And pretty much the next day, I handed in my resignation because she just opened up so many fields. And really what happened there, and I'm curious I don't know if you want to share what your own journey has been, but with her in that 3-hour session, I realized that next to the outer world, right, the world that we can touch, that we can measure, there's this whole inner world, right, inside of me. And I was like, I can't believe no one's told me this, right? Like I've been to business school. I've been to a top consulting firm. Like I'm supposed to be clever. And nobody told me that there was this amazing inner world and that it's at least as interesting as the outer world, right? And suddenly I realized a lot of the things that my parents didn't get to work on in their lives because they weren't lucky in the same way to have that sort of coaching session that opened up that world. I could work through quite a lot of the things that happened to me in my childhood, the things that had made me happy and successful, the things that, were holding me back. And over the next few years, I did quite a lot of whatever you want to call it, personal development work. And time after time, it just gave me more freedom to make the choices that are really mine and to become the person that I think I was supposed to become.
That's awesome to hear. And you're absolutely right. Once you start doing the inner exploration, you realize it's a very rich field and there's a lot there. And for me, at least, it's a ton of fun. I mean, I'll share with you, same idea. I went to all the fancy schools and I got my MBA and all this stuff. And I was working in the software field and I started a company. Okay, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And I started to realize man, this is really hard work. It feels like I'm getting, punched in the face 10 times a day. And that was really taking a toll on me, right? Just like the stress of being an entrepreneur. And it was my wife who really like gave me the encouragement. I mean, encouragement in the form of like a big slap on the back of my head. Like, what's the matter with you? Like, why are you so miserable? Right? Was what she said. Why are you so miserable? You're supposed to be at the top of your game. Why are you so miserable? And for me, it led to this, tremendous amount of inner work to say, what is really going on here? And as I learned to understand myself better, then I was getting involved in all these other entrepreneur circles and as a mentor to other entrepreneurs. And I started to realize, wow, everybody has these same demons that they're wrestling with. And that was really the moment that Conscious Entrepreneur came together, was realizing I'm not alone. Other people have these same challenges. I certainly don't have the answers, but we can try to figure all this stuff out together.
Oh, two things came up for me as you were speaking. The first one is, as you were sharing, like your wife telling you that you're miserable. I remember this moment. So I was working at McKinsey, this consulting firm, and there was a young colleague my age, I don't know, I was late 20s, early 30s, and he had cancer, right? And so the news spread, and everybody was shocked, and I was shocked at the voice that came up in me in that moment, and the voice was, "If only I had that excuse." And I was like, "Whoa!" Right? So I knew that sort of this thing that I was, the trajectory I was on wasn't satisfying for me.
If only I had that excuse, then I could quit my job, follow my passion, do what I really want to do, be who I really want to be.
Exactly. All of those things.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that was a big wake-up call. The other thing that really resonated with me is, like, inner work is fun. Like, it makes you free. It makes you, come more alive. It makes you, more of who you are. And I think that unfortunately we have been marked by this idea that came, from Freud and psychoanalysis, which was like sort of the first time the West sort of, had a look inside. And Freud came very much up with this thing of like, ooh, look, when you look inside, there's a lot of demons in there, and there's a lot of like, it's pretty dirty in there, and you don't really want to look inside. And I haven't found that. Like, I found that, like, when you look inside, like, you might encounter some hurt or something, but you really find a lot of, light, if that's what you want to call it. I mean, you totally find a lot of, and so it's definitely made me more free. And maybe the last thing to say about that is, you said that your wife pushed you. And one of the things that makes me sad is that it still seems easier for now for women often to go down that route than for men.
It does.
And when you go into the space of, workshops and personal development, you tend to have 70, 80% women and 20, 30% men. By the way, if you're a man and you want to meet amazing women, start doing it at work, because you'll find yourself in these spaces. Because there's still, I think, sort of a narrative of men should be self-reliant and should never show any weakness, and, should never show any vulnerability. And so we don't talk about these things. And, that was a space I was in for a long time. Yeah. And boy, I'm glad that I left that space behind, because it wasn't helpful. It wasn't serving.
And so your personal evolution of consciousness, to call it that, your personal consciousness started to change and started to evolve. And then that married your research. So your research started to match that. And you were then learning about companies. And in many ways, the transition into the teal organization, or reinventing these organizations, is like developing organizational consciousness, essentially, is what it is. How did all that start to tie together for you?
So, I had already left McKinsey. I had started my own practice, still consulting, but it was going way more into sort of the coaching field and the facilitation field, and having like these deep conversations with leaders that, leaders of big organizations that were typically 15 years older than I was, huge egos. And I realized, like, I had this gift of breaking through to them, of like, their egos, to sunlight, relax and share what was really, really important. And so this work felt amazing to me. I thought, like, I have found my path. This is Fred for the next 20 years, like Fred, the coach consultant to these big ego, CEOs. And 4 years into that work, I suddenly had this moment of sadness come up. and lack of energy, which I really couldn't place because my life at the time was amazing. I'd met Ellen, my wife. We just had our first baby, and my work was really meaningful. I was well paid. I was like, I had hit the jackpot. And then I realized I no longer could do this kind of work that I was doing, not because I didn't like the interactions I had with these corporate leaders, but because the structures around them were so unhealthy. And so if I was really honest with myself, like behind closed doors with, leaders, I had these amazing conversations. But the most likely outcome was that they ended up leaving the corporate world because they went through, some inner shift and said like, you know what, I have some other passions, and, and I would share. And I was being paid by these organizations to help their best people leave. And, that didn't make much sense.
Right.
But the structures were so unhealthy that once I left, same thing when I was facilitating, sessions with executive committees, like we would finally talk about the things, the taboos that weren't talked about, the power relations and the politics and all of that, and the lack of trust. And everybody was like, finally we can talk about these things. But then when I would leave the room, the same things would happen again, because that's what I realized. It's not a lack of capacity on their part. It's the system and structures and the pyramid, the way we've set up things, that naturally push people to behave in those ways. We so often think, the problem is our leaders. If only we had these, amazing conscious leaders who had done all of their inner work, or were able to collaborate better, or, were able to be more vulnerable, or whatever you think is, then we would have amazing organizations. And the truth is, no, the structures themselves, right, prevent these things from happening. The structures themselves have become toxic, or have become, just a limitation given the complexity of our times. And so I suddenly realized, like, I was going into these large organizations, they have lobbies with marble and glass, and, and everybody was running around and like, doing, next year's budget and, whatever, the next value chain meeting. And I was just coming to a stage where I was looking at them and said, like, do you still believe in any of this? Right. And so I sort of realized I had reached my breaking point where, I could no longer serve these organizations, because I realized, like, I actually cannot fix it. Like, I'm just this little Band-Aid that is, a little bit of a point of grease, in in the machinery, but the machinery itself might have to be dismantled. And I was lucky that I had read Ken Wilber and some other stuff, and knew about these stages, and so I had language for what was happening to me, which was, what, I'm tired of these orange organizations, right? Of this orange way of running things. It seems like I've evolved past that. And so, okay, I can no longer work with these organizations, but this question about, like, how do we come together? How do we do amazing things when we come together to work? Whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit or a hospital or whatever, like, was still fascinating to me. And so that's where the question came up, because I had read, Wilber's stuff, and I was like, I think that I start to look at the world through these teal lenses. So if I still want to do this kind of work, could I do this with teal organizations? Are there teal organizations out there? What would that even look like? And that started the research, that led, 3 years later to, this book being published.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to take a quick detour and then get back into the book, into the content of the book. But a lot of people know Ken Wilber here in Colorado. I live in Boulder, Colorado. He's local here, very well-known philosopher. And it's a big deal to have someone like that write the foreword to your book. So how did you go about making that happen? He's well known at the beginning. This was your first book, your first piece of work. How did you get connected with him and make that happen? This
was like a total fluke and a gift from the universe, because I didn't know Ken Wilber. But his thinking had influenced my book. And so, as I was getting ready to publish it, or actually self-publish it, I thought, like, out of courtesy, I should send him a copy of the manual. So I just printed out his thing. I had no idea, you can't find him online. And so who do I send this to? It so happened that a friend, through some connection, had his address. So I just sent like this letter, by mail, never expected to hear anything back. Like, this guy is, brilliant and must receive, I don't know how many, And a week later, I received this enthusiastic email where he says, like, this is amazing. Can I write a forward for it? Like, I hadn't even dared to ask for like a blurb on the back of the book. I'd not ask anything. He says, and then he says, and I would like to record a conversation with you.
Hey,
and share it with my readers. And the conversation was amazing. We were scheduled for an hour. It turned into a 6-hour conversation.
6-hour conversation.
6-hour conversation. We had to stop and do it over 2 days because our batteries just all died. And it was amazing, by the way, because that's where I got to see sort of the brilliance of Ken Wilber, who must have some form of photographic memory, because he obviously knew my book better than I did. And I had worked for 3 years on it. He obviously knew it better than I did. It was like, anyway, we had this conversation, and then he's, when I received the email, we're going to launch it, tomorrow to our 50,000, followers. And I think my luck was I had decided to self-publish it because it gave me the most freedom, including the ebook is available in a pay what feels right form. So you download the ebook and then you make the promise that a month later you donate whatever it was worth for you. And he wrote that in his newsletter. And out of the 50,000 people, 1,000 downloaded the book. And that started the word of mouth. We now reached 1 million copies, which is ridiculous. But that 1 million copies is really thanks to like the first 1,000, because I'm the worst marketer and self-promoter. That book would have, so that was sort of like my
fun. That's a great story, and it just shows that for so many people have told me that the hard part about writing a book isn't writing a book, it's marketing the book and getting the word out. And sometimes you tap into these like total luck, and it works out really well for you.
Yeah. And it wouldn't have worked any other way because I wouldn't have marketed it. So that's how it had to happen, I guess.
Very cool. So let's get back into the content here. So you've got these 3 pillars of evolution, or that are part of the evolution in organizational evolution here, which is self-management, wholeness, and having an evolutionary purpose. So these are sort of the important threads that go through these types of companies. Walk us through what those mean, and what are the highlights that we need to know about those.
So, to tie this back to our previous part of the conversation, every time you have this leap to this new management model, there's a number of breakthroughs that happen, right? So, for instance, when we went from these organizations like mafias to the organization from the agrarian age, that's when we invented the pyramid and the org chart with fixed reporting lines and fixed job descriptions, right? That was an amazing invention that is a few hundred years old. Now the 3 breakthroughs that seem to come with this latest leap are, as you said, self-management, wholeness, evolutionary purpose. So we can take them one by one. Self-management is this radical innovation that says that, the complexity of our times, the speed at which things evolve, cannot be managed with this pyramid, this fixed pyramid with fixed reporting lines. It's just overwhelmed, right? The few people at the top are completely overworked because, that's at the top of the pyramid is where all lines converge. And so any decision that is made that is sort of cross-functional in nature gets sucked up to the top because that's the only place where these lines meet. And then these poor people have to digest PowerPoint after PowerPoint after PowerPoint, like with insufficient knowledge, asked to make these tremendously complex decisions. Like I have a lot of respect and, for, these leaders. And so that model is breaking down. And if you look at any complex system in the world, right, if we look at nature, like if we look at a forest is an incredibly complex system with billions of living organisms, from the tallest trees to the bacteria to the fungi. There is no org chart. Like imagine a forest running with a fixed, there's an executive committee, like, and whatever happened, like the winter comes in early, right? And like, the 5 trees of the executive committee, which are the 5 tallest trees, say to everyone else, like, don't do anything, don't adapt. Like, we will come up with a plan, right? And then they, make a plan, and then they tell everybody, the bacteria and the fungi and the ferns, like, what they should do, right? And obviously by that time, the winter's already over, before they make a plan, right? So complex ecosystems like that have a way of evolving extraordinarily powerfully. They're extraordinarily connected, right? Like the trees and the fungi, and they're able to process information way faster than a pyramid, right? take the human brain, 85 billion cells, right? We don't have an executive committee in our, we don't have like the five neurons that say like, every decision has to come past us. And so the interesting thing is that we've cracked the way, I mean, not I, but a number of amazing entrepreneurs that I researched have cracked a way to do that inside organizations. And the term self-management is great and frustrating because almost as soon as you talk about that, people imagine, oh, it means no structure. Everybody can do whatever they want. And, decision-making is consensus. Everybody has to weigh in on every decision. And it's the opposite of that. But unfortunately, that's sort of the image that comes up for most people. And they go like, that doesn't work.
Right.
And indeed, it doesn't work. Like a lot of people have tried it. And then it's so painful. People say like, give me back, hierarchy, give me hierarchy because it works. But self-management has a lot of structure. It has very clear rules about like, who can make what decision, how, who do you need to involve? And but they're very, very fluid things. So rather than having like a fixed pyramid and then the world evolves and then like a few years later, you're like, oh, we have to go through this massive redesign to adapt our pyramid to how the world has evolved. Like these structures evolve on a continuous basis. And so you never have like these breaking points.
Mm-hmm. So self-management is about flattening. It's about flattening the structure, removing the hierarchy, but it's not about blowing up decision-making, and it's not about chaos and anarchy.
Yeah. And even what you're saying is in some ways is right, but like the flattening, one of the misconceptions is that these organizations have no hierarchy. And it's true, they have no fixed dominator hierarchies, right? Which is like, Alex, I'm your boss. And so this is fixed. Right. And so whatever decision you make, I can overrule it. I can decide if you get promoted, if you get a cool project, if you get fired, if you get a raise. That fixed relationship no longer exists. But instead, what you have is lots of real hierarchies or informal hierarchies or hierarchies of competence, of energy, of will, of interest. Right. And so you and I, might be, let's say that you're more senior than I am. Right. So you might have way more competence in certain domains. So obviously you should make those decisions more than I do. But suddenly I have this one interest or this one knowledge area or that you don't have. And so I get to make those decisions and not you. And so, we still have hierarchies. You don't want to say like the most junior person in the company gets as much say as, the founder or the most senior person in the company, because that would be stupid, right? So again, so these metaphors from nature are sort of helpful, which is, in nature, like in the forest, you have a tree that's way taller than a mushroom or a fern. And the goal is not to flatten this thing. The goal is not to make the tree, as small as the mushroom so that everyone's equal. What we want is to have the most healthy, beautiful tree and the most healthy, beautiful mushroom and the most healthy and beautiful fern. And that happens, through forms of self-management.
It's a lot of trust. It's a lot of empowerment, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot of actually the same thing. Like, as you were saying earlier, we have to reinvent language, right? And like the word of empowerment is also a word that I find a little problematic, because the word empowerment still means like, hey, let's say I'm the founder, right? Or I was the CEO. I'm moving this direction now. By my good graces, Alex, you are empowered.
Right. I bless you with empowerment.
Exactly. Right. And I give a little bit of my power away. Right. But actually, if you run these structures well, I don't give any of my power away. I'm still fully powerful to make the decisions that I'm best able to make. But I'm no longer burdened by you making me do decisions that you were much better to make. Right. So I'm fully powerful, you're fully powerful. And actually, the more powerful you are, like the more things you put in motion, the bigger, like the better our playing field, the more I get to do cool things, right? And so it's not that I'm like, okay, I have to give power away because, we want to empower people. It's actually we build these structures where anybody who senses a problem or an opportunity can act on it. And so any problem opportunity I sense as a founder, I can still run with it. Like I don't hold myself back. But any problem opportunity that you see, you can run with it. And there are these ways in which you cannot just do anything you want. You have to get the advice from the right people, in order for this to work and make sense.
Okay, so
and what
that's
we know, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say that's the self-management concept. So that's the quick idea of that particular one.
Yeah, and we just have enough organizations out there who've been running in this way for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and are extraordinarily successful to know that if you do this well, this outperforms any traditional hierarchy. And I'm always hesitant to say that, because if you only go that route because you think that will make you more effective, it won't work. Like it has to come from like this mindset shift or this perspective of, hey, this pyramid doesn't make any sense to me anymore. Like this is way too rigid, and I don't want to be this person at the top, right? That is alone there, that has to make all of these decisions so quickly without the right context. Like I want people, to be able to make the same kind of decisions that I want to make. And then it just happens to be, way more agile and powerful than the traditional model. So yeah, that's the first breakthrough. Another breakthrough, I call it, striving for wholeness. In most traditional organizations, there's something that pushes us to show up in certain ways with a sort of professional mask.
Right.
I don't know if that rings
true.
You
were talking about yourself, wearing a suit and holding your laptop case and so on as you're checking into a 5-star hotel as part of a McKinsey briefing and so on. And so that's an example of that, right?
It's an example, and that's sort of a literal example of, sort of the mask of the suit. And, like I wear different clothes during the week than I would on the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, and I think more importantly, sort of the subtle mask. In most organizations, we show up way more determined. You could say way more masculine, of like, I know what I'm doing. I have everything in control. I hide all my doubts, my questions, my weaknesses, right? We favor the rational part of ourselves, right? Like facts and figures, that's all great. But actually trusting the intuitive part of that, like, at McKinsey, I could never say like, my intuition just tells me this isn't right. Like that, wasn't done. And yet, like, ask any company founder and they know like that they're, checking in with the intuition is like a really solid skill. But like nobody ever talks about that, because that's you hide that behind a mask and then you rationalize things, right? And you never talk about these things. You certainly never talk, about emotions or spiritual aspects of yourself. No, that should all stay at home, right? And so you can go on and on. And so we tend to show up in this very narrow way, right? Pretty determined, masculine, rational. And, that comes from sort of this historic idea that, that's the best way to control people, right? It comes back all the way, these organizations as armies. Like if we shave everybody's head and everybody wears the same thing, people become interchangeable and they become controllable, right? And so we're still on the tail end of that, where we ideally, want everybody to behave sort of and show up in pretty much the same ways, because then things are predictable. Right?
Yeah, and it's also the point is like I'm playing a role, right? So I'm playing a role, so I'm not myself. I'm a character, right? So that's part of how I'm showing up at work, is in the character of somebody working as opposed to who I might actually be.
Exactly. And because I want to fit my box and my job description and my, and so what these teal, quote unquote, organizations have understood is, if I'm showing up only with part of myself, if there's so much of myself that I leave behind, at home, then there's also a huge amount of my energy, my passion, and my creativity that I leave behind, right? And if so many organizations feel somewhat lifeless, I've come to see it is because we leave so much life behind. And so some of these organizations I've researched, it's just fascinating how vibrant they are, because people are invited to show up whole. And showing up whole doesn't mean that you show up stupid, silly, in underwear, or, like people, don't do that when you give them the freedom to show up whole. But if you lower the fears of being yourself, people suddenly show up with way more energy, way more willingness to see the other person, help, step in, go beyond, because you just know, like, Alex, I really know you. I really see you. Like, I know that you're struggling because, something has happened in your life. Like, okay, let's think about, like, how as a whole team we can,
the energy point is so important here, because, I mean, let me just put it this way. It's exhausting to not be yourself. It's exhausting to feel like you have to be in a mold, wear a mask. In the entrepreneur world, people talk about putting on armor every day, right? Like, it's exhausting to have to do that. And it's so liberating. And we tap into our entrepreneurial capacity. We tap into our capacity when we're allowed to be whole.
Yeah.
We're encouraged to be whole. Let me put it that way, not allowed. Like, when we're encouraged to be whole.
Yeah. I can share, it's just a minor story, but that I heard recently. It's an organization, they here in North America, they do textiles. They spin sort of high-end textiles, right? And it was very traditionally run. And then the woman who was leading it had a burnout, came back and decided, okay, I'm done with the way I led this. And so she just created, all these self-managing teams. And she didn't even put in like much thought about this wholeness, but just these self-managing teams, started doing things like at the beginning of every shift, they would do a quick check-in, just like, how is everybody doing? Is there anything we should know? Right? It doesn't, not very revolutionary, but over time, these people on the shop floor just developed this real trust with each other because they would tell each other really how they were, right? And she told me the story of, like, in one of these groups, one guy wasn't able to talk that morning and say how he was. And, the guy sitting next to him who knew him well was like, I'm going to speak on his behalf because it's so hard for him to share. Last night, his wife kicked him out and he's in a hotel, and, it's, his world is breaking down, right? And within half an hour, they had found him an apartment he could stay in. They had found him furniture. They had found him, right, a new temporary life, right? And here were all these colleagues stepping in, right? I mean, that could happen in any organizations. But frankly, I've worked in a lot of organizations. I can't remember an organization where the culture was there for people to share these kind of things, the very next morning from, when this happened. And then people naturally rallying in that way, right? And it was just because people were, right? But this is an example of how they helped this guy outside of work.
Yeah.
Right.
Amazing.
But the same thing then start to happen inside of work. Right. Imagine I make a really stupid mistake, but now I feel like the trust, I will share it immediately with everybody involved rather than trying to hide it or blame it, or right. And people will immediately rally to help me out and fix this thing. Right. And I mean, the amount of work and problems and side meetings and chatter and that we avoid by simply having, this level of me daring to show up whole, right, is amazing. So this is not just like a woo-woo thing of like, isn't it wonderful you can show up whole, but it has like real, work consequences. And in many ways, these things aren't complicated to put in place. It has to do with a lot of the HR processes. Like, it's just, in order for people to show up more fully, we need to recruit slightly differently, right? We need to evaluate slightly differently. We need to, come together slightly differently. We can do meetings slightly differently, right? And, for me, in this research, I realized, actually, if you think about it, the recruiting is where the lying starts, right? The recruitment is typically like the company puts up their best face, right? Now we have like employer branding, and we use all of the techniques that we use in advertising marketing to fool people into buying our products, to fool people to join our company, right? And then me, as a recruit, like, obviously, in my resume, like, I try to make it look as good as possible. I hide a few things, right? And then the first conversation we have is this conversation where we're both trying to see, poke holes into the image of the other. Like, I mean, that's a pretty sad way to start, right? And so how could we do recruitment differently so that right from the start, like, I can relax as a person showing up, and the company can relax, and we're not pretending to be what we're not.
Okay, so that's wholeness. That was self-management, and then wholeness. And the third one is evolutionary purpose, which sounds like a big deal. It sounds like a big thing. And I might think to myself, what happens if I don't have some great big huge evolutionary purpose for my company?
Yeah. It's again one of those things where, words are tricky because it represents a new reality, and so we project old things onto this. And so a lot of people think evolutionary purpose simply means having an amazing purpose, right? Having a great mission statement, right? And I hear that people like who read my book and it's like, oh yeah, evolutionary purpose, we've done that. We have a great, mission.
Check. Right.
And that's not what evolutionary purpose is about at all. What evolutionary purpose is about is this idea that rather than predicting and controlling the future, right, which is what we've inherited from the scientific industrial revolution, organizations as machines, we will sense and respond to the future that's emerging. Right? So traditional organizations have put in place this whole arsenal of things to predict and control the future, right? And up until the moment where I was researching this book, that made sense to me. Like, how else would you do it, right? So, a great leader, right, sets a great course, strategy and then execution, right? I set a great course and then the whole organization executes on that strategy, right? And so every 2 or 3 years, we do a big strategic exercise. We chart the course for the next 3 years or whatever it is, right? And then, in order to get there, we set all sorts of milestones, and then the yearly budget helps us with this. And then, we have ideally just budgets cascade through the organizations, and we have all our incentive systems, and your KPIs are exactly matched to this thing so that you contribute to this whole thing. And, we've created this whole predict and control, strategy, execution. But if we believe that the world is evolving too fast, we no longer do predict and control, we do sense and respond. Right? That's what nature does. That's what incredibly complex systems do, is yes, they have a sense of where they want to go, but then they're constantly sensing and responding to how, to all of the signals that are coming in. The problem with our 3-year plans and our budgets is we so badly want to make them happen that we often prefer to ignore the information that comes in, and that would tell us that we need to change these plans. Right? Because that's annoying. Like, oh no, shit, like these information doesn't fit our plans. Let's stick to the plans and let's try to avoid this information. And obviously we want to do the opposite. We want to constantly take in this information, and we still have plans, right? We need to have plans, but these plans constantly evolve with the information. They're never sort of really fixed, right? Brian Robertson, who's the founder of a self-managing system called Holacracy, has this, I think, beautiful metaphor where he says, imagine we'd run a bike, we drive a bike in the way we run a traditional organization, right? Before getting on the bike, we would map out the exact terrain, and we break it down into like this perfect plan, like our yearly budgets, right? Where we'd say like, okay, I start, the handles at, this angle. And then after 2.6 seconds, I get to this crossing, I move to this angle. And then after 3.2 seconds, and then ideally we start pedaling and we close our eyes so that we really stay focused, on the plan, right? And don't get distracted, right?
Sure.
And obviously something happens. There's a pothole where we weren't expecting it. A car is parked where it shouldn't have been. And boom, we fall down and we, hurt ourselves. And then we go like, oh, okay, I know what the problem is. We didn't plan well enough. We should plan even better, right? Next time we should have potholes as part of the plan, and right. And obviously this is not how we ride a bike, right? With a bike, we know where the destination is that we want to get to. By the way, we're open to potentially discovering that there's an even cooler destination along the way, right? So we're opening up our eyes because maybe, there's something even better waiting for us. But we have a sense of where we want to go. And then we step onto the bike and we keep all of our senses open, right? Not only the wind, but our sense of balance and, the spin, the speed of the wind and like all of that. And we constantly adjust, right? And we constantly look, and then we realize like, hey, there's more traffic here. Let me go to the right. And like, oh, this actually looks nice. There's a sunset over there. Let me go, And so that's how we ride a bike. And, we now have ways to run organizations in that way. Right. And I guess listeners, everybody who's a listener will be familiar with agile programming.
Right.
Agile programming is a small example of that, where we've left behind, these sort of waterfall charts where we planned and wrote out the specs, for these huge, programming things, for the next whatever year, 2 years, 3 years, and we knew that they weren't working, that this was bloated, and pretty much the whole world has moved to agile programming, where we have these small sprints and lots of inputs, and it's just proven a superior way of doing things. And so we've been able to do that for software development, and basically what these teal organizations do is do that for the whole organization. And it was so interesting for me because I wasn't very familiar with agile programming, so I didn't write very much about it, but the book was a huge hit in the agile
community, I bet.
Because a lot of people recognized that and said, like, hey, this is what we're doing on a small scale. And is it possible to do that, for the whole organization?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, I can certainly see the link to agile there. Yeah, for sure. And so, those are the things that I'm doing as I'm going through this metamorphosis into a teal organization: self-management, wholeness, evolutionary purpose. I want to ask a question now, which is, you said earlier that in a previous iteration, kind of post McKinsey, you were doing consulting and you were working with people, and one of the things, and they were on, and you were also doing a lot of your own personal work. Let's say that I'm committed to bringing about a teal organization.
Yep.
My question is, who do I need to be in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I think you need to be somebody willing to go on an adventure, right? This is a relatively new model. We have companies out there who've been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years who are very successful. So, it's out there, but still, for most people, this feels pretty new, right? And so as you're inviting your colleagues to go on this way, this will be a big adventure. You will learn tons. You will suddenly face some old beliefs that you have and go like, whoa, like, I'm not ready for that step. Like, that still feels risky. I'm looking at old ways of controlling. Like, that made me feel safe and in control. Now this feels like I'm letting go of a lot of things. And so you have to be open to learning and to learning in public. Okay, so that's the precondition. And I have a friend in France who is working with a lot of leaders who go down this route, and they often come to him and say, read Frederic's book, this is what I want to do. And he often says, like, that's amazing. Let you and I talk for a while before you even go down this route. Maybe we'll talk for 3 months, 6 months, a year, just to really understand, what is it in that you find attractive? What is it in that feels crazy, that feels right? I think the worst thing you can do is go gung-ho, I've just read this book, we have to become a teal organization, right? Never sell it as a model. No one wants to be a model. Like, I would like a teal organization. That doesn't mean anything. You have to be able to speak from within about why that is important, right? And so what this friend does with a lot of these leaders is really help them clarify, what is it that attracts you in that model, and speak about it from your own, history, from your own interest. I was talking about Decathlon. They had this CEO who did these amazing things. And I remember the first time I met him and I asked him, why do you want to do this? And he just had these compelling stories. Like, I started in the store at the lowest level, and we used to be this young company, very entrepreneurial. You were the youngest person in the store. You had all of these freedoms. You could do amazing things. And we had so much fun, right? We were all really sporty people, and like, it was amazing. And now we have this, 100,000 people organization, and we have all these layers of management. And I see these young people, and he was telling it like it came from his heart, from his guts. Like, when he was telling that story, you could feel his pain of like, I don't like this organization that we've become. And so he was able to speak about it in a way where he wasn't saying like self-management or teal or, which are helpful for us to understand it, but become a distraction because these are just concepts, right? He was able to say, I want to go to an organization where, we just use people's talents. And the youngest person, if they're brilliant, they should be able to run with amazing things, right? And so that's, so it's a lot of thinking about it, introspection, getting ready, and then, inviting other people to join you in that race. By the way, this was just a glimpse about it, but I don't even know, Alex, if you've come across it. After the book came out a few years later, I created this video series about everything I've learned for people who take a traditional organization and transform it. It's called Insights for the Journey. Maybe we can link in the show notes. And it's 130 short videos of everything I've learned, like the pitfalls, the things that work, the things that don't work, the typical mistakes people make as they go along this route. And actually, the whole first section is thoughts for the founder or CEO.
Cool. Awesome.
Like, before you even get going, like, what are some of the things to consider?
Very cool. I've heard of it. I'm aware of it, but I have not watched it myself. And we will send that out. Well, thank you so much for this kind of overview of your work and of your thoughts, and congrats on the 10-year milestone and selling 1 million copies. Those are really tremendous achievements. I know that there's some other programs and other projects right now that are tugging at your heart, particularly around climate mobilization. Tell us more about what's going on in 2024.
Yeah. So a year ago, I launched this new project that I started with my wife. Now we're sort of a growing team. It's called The Week. And it's this program that allows all of us, which is probably like, 80, 90% of us, who know that climate change is happening, who know that biodiversity is collapsing, that things don't look good for the environment. So, we're not part of the 10, 20% of climate deniers, right? We know that this is bad. We've heard that it's actually really bad. We heard that experts are freaking out, right? And yet we feel overwhelmed. We feel like this is pretty depressing. We feel sort of small in the face of that, and we don't really know what to do. And there's part of us, whether we care to admit it or not, that feels like maybe I should be doing something. Like, if this is as bad as people say, maybe I should be doing something. If I have kids, like, part of me really worries about the world they will live in, and yet I'm not doing something. And so we all sort of tend to live in this massive cognitive dissonance of, like, there's this announced apocalypse. And if you look at, just Hollywood, it looks like almost all movies are apocalyptic. It's as if that's some unconscious way for us to digest and deal with the fact that it looks like the world is really in a bad shape. And yet I'm not doing enough, and I feel bad about it, right? And I live with this cognitive dissonance. And so 4 or 5 years ago, I found myself and my wife, we realized, like, hey, every time we see a climate article pass by or something, we read the first few lines and then we push it away because it feels too much and depressing. And then we decided that one day, like, hey, no, let's have the courage to really look at it. Let's really find out what's going to happen to me, to, when we get old, what's going to happen to our kids. And we were shocked when we really read the science. We were absolutely shocked. And it became real the day we calculated. Like, one day I calculated how old I'll be in 2050 and how old my kids will be in 2050. Because a lot of, what the scientists predict, like in 2050, we'll have between 200 million and 1 billion climate refugees. I mean, wars, famine, right? And 2050 feels far away. Until I calculate, hey, 2050, I will be, retired, but still pretty, hopefully in good shape and young, and my kids will be younger than I am today. They will be in their mid-30s. They will be maybe just establishing themselves, maybe become parents, and that's the world where we have all of those things happening. And suddenly, and so that's when we decided, okay, we want to do something to help the largest amount of people to get out of this cognitive dissonance, to find a space where they can really interact with this topic. And so the way the week works is you get a group of people together, a group of friends or a group of family or colleagues in the workplace. And this starts to spread a lot in the workplace. We've had like 70,000 people go through it so far, and half of them were in the workplace. You get together 3 times during a week, hence the week. And every time you watch a 1-hour documentary about the topic, and then we set up a half-hour conversation in a very specific format where we just listen to each other, where there's no crosstalk, no debate, just like, what is knowing this doing to ourselves? And the 3 days sort of lead us to this, we call it a U-shaped journey. So episode 1 is pretty brutal. It gets you down to the reality of this, and it brings often off some fear, some sadness, some shock. But then you don't get stuck there. The second episode is sort of like, how do I digest this? And the third one, you come out of it, and people tend to come out of it full of energy and enthusiasm of like, okay, this is an incredible human adventure that it's opening up for us, this collective adventure the next 10, 20, 30 years as we get to turn this around. And instead of pushing this away, like, what if this could be like this amazing thing where I can find my place, where I can contribute, where I can be part of millions, who turn this around. And so it's this process that starts to go really viral because people at the end of it come out of it just full of energy, in part because we don't tell them what to do. Like, who am I to tell people what to do? It's rather like there's so many things you can do depending on your talents and your job and your, what would you want to do? What would give you joy? Like, this is a collective human adventure to, protect our kids. Where do you want to play? Who do you want to join? Who do you want to meet? And so, it's this really relatively short experience, 3 times an hour and a half, with people that you like or love, or colleagues, or in your church or whatever it is, your salsa group, and you get together and you have these really profound conversations because you talk about some of the most essential things about, like, what's the future we're going to have? What's the future we're leaving for our kids? What do we want to do about it?
Sounds really powerful. Sounds like a great gift out there, especially we do need a lot of mobilization on this right now. Well, hey, Frederic Laloux, this was a tremendous conversation. I really appreciate the tour through Teal Organizations and Reinventing Organizations, the book. Again, congrats on the 10-year anniversary and the new edition coming out. Great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on The Conscious Entrepreneur.
This was so fun. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.